The wind tore across the desert like a living thing, carrying grit and sand that stung Joe Hawthorne's face and whipped her auburn hair into her eyes. Her wagon wheels sank with every turn, the wooden rims groaning under the strain. The sun blazed overhead, relentless, and her horse panted, struggling to pull the load through the shifting dunes. Joe's hands were raw, calloused from gripping the reins, and her mouth tasted of dust and salt. She cursed under her breath, muttering words her father would have disapproved of. "Just a few more miles, Joe. Just get through this," she told herself. Joe was 30, lean and strong, with green eyes that had learned to assess danger in an instant. Her life so far had been marked by hardship and loss. Her father, a homesteader, had died suddenly, leaving her to claim the land he had dreamed of taming. But this desert, vast and merciless, seemed determined to swallow her whole. Every ridge and shadow played tricks on her, making her feel smaller, weaker, and painfully alone. A sudden, unexpected sound froze her in place, the unmistakable thunder of hooves on sand. She squinted into the haze, heart tightening, and saw two figures approaching. Dust swirled around them, but even from a distance, she could see the taller man's striking frame, broad-shouldered and muscular, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders, adorned with small beads and feathers that swayed with every step. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers, and Joe felt a strange, unnerving pull in her chest. The second figure was smaller, leaner, tense. Both men rode with a confidence born of the land, each movement deliberate. Joe's instincts screamed caution. She reached for the rifle across her lap, hands trembling, but her voice was firm when she called out, "Stay back." The taller man raised a hand, slowly, deliberately. "No harm," he said, his voice calm but deep, steadying in the chaos of the desert. "Name's Elias. You look like you could use some help." Joe's green eyes narrowed. She had learned that kindness often carried hidden dangers. But the sun beat down on her back and her horse was faltering. Trusting a stranger felt perilous, yet refusing might be fatal. "Help," she repeated, her voice low, cautious. She didn't lower the rifle but let her posture relax just enough. Elias dismounted, boots crunching over the sand, and came closer, leading a second horse with packs of water and provisions. His presence was commanding, silent yet impossible to ignore. He moved with a fluid strength that reminded Joe of predators she had read about in her father's journals, calm, aware, and always ready. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Joe hesitated. She had always been fiercely independent, but the desert had eroded some of that stubbornness. "West," she said finally. "My father's land. But this desert—" She gestured helplessly at the endless dunes. "It doesn't care if I live or die." Elias nodded, understanding. "I've crossed these parts enough to know the tricks it plays. Stick with me. You'll get there." Her pulse quickened, not just from relief, but from a subtle, inexplicable reaction to his presence. She was aware of every detail, the way the sun glinted off his dark hair, how his coat fluttered with movement, the quiet strength in the line of his jaw. Her heart told her to retreat, but something deeper, almost instinctual, whispered that she might survive this crossing because of him. Together, they set off. Elias rode slightly ahead, scanning the horizon with eyes trained to catch danger in the smallest shadow. Joe kept close, adjusting the wagon wheels over dunes, each mile a test of endurance. The wind carried the scent of dry earth, sweat, and the faint tang of her horse. Sand scraped against her arms, sanded her cheeks, and she felt it inside her mouth and eyes, yet she refused to complain. By midday, exhaustion pressed in like a physical weight. The sun struck without mercy, turning the desert into a furnace. Joe's horse faltered again, and she cursed softly under her breath. Elias rode back to her side without a word, dismounting to help guide the animals through a treacherous stretch of soft sand. The proximity of his body, strong and sure, made her pulse race in ways she hadn't anticipated. She forced herself to focus on the task, forcing the awareness of him aside, but it was impossible. As afternoon bled into evening, they reached a narrow canyon. The walls rose sharply, shadowing the sun's harsh rays and offering the promise of shelter. Elias helped anchor the wagon, the creak of ropes and wood mingling with the wind whispering through the canyon. A fire crackled between rocks, its smoke sweet with the scent of pine, a rare reprieve from the dry, bitter smell of sand. Dinner was meager hardtack, jerky, and some dried fruit Joe had saved, but conversation was sparse. Each assessed the other quietly, understanding more through observation than words. Elias's eyes lingered on Joe once, just long enough to make her heart thump violently. She looked away, flustered, and busied herself with tending the fire. Night fell fast and the temperature dropped, sending a chill through the canyon. Joe shivered, pulling her blanket tight around her. Elias noticed, wordlessly removing his coat and draping it over her shoulders. His touch was warm and grounding, making her shiver in a different, unfamiliar way. "It's not safe to wander alone in these parts," he said softly, the cadence of his voice low and steady. Joe swallowed hard. She wanted to protest, to reclaim her independence with words, but the desert and the night whispered a harsh truth. Sometimes survival meant leaning on someone else. For the first time in years, she felt a mix of relief and something dangerously close to attraction. She pulled the coat closer, noting the faint scent of him, earthy and sharp, a scent she would remember long after the fire burned out. As they settled into the uneasy sleep that only the desert could demand, Joe lay awake for a while, listening to the wind as it whistled through the canyon walls. She saw Elias watching the darkness, silent and vigilant. And in that moment, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. Perhaps she didn't have to face this wild, merciless land entirely alone. The stars stretched across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The desert, vast and unforgiving, was no less dangerous, but now it held a strange promise. Survival, she realized, might not be enough. Perhaps out here, in the brutal expanse of sand and wind, she could find something she had never imagined: trust, companionship, and maybe, against all reason, a connection that would warm her in ways she hadn't thought possible. And for the first time in a long while, Joe allowed herself to hope. The morning sun spilled gold across the desert as Josephine adjusted her bonnet, squinting against the glare. The wagon creaked as the horses slowly trod over the softer sand leading toward a narrow river crossing. For the first time in days, Joe tasted hope, not just survival, but progress. The river's glimmer promised water, shade, and a temporary reprieve from the relentless heat. Elias rode beside her, silent but watchful. His long black hair fell over his shoulders in dark waves, and the beads and feathers he wore swayed with every movement. He scanned the horizon constantly, eyes sharp and unyielding. "Almost there," he said finally, voice low, carrying both reassurance and authority. Joe nodded, gripping the reins tighter, her knuckles white. The horses' hooves sank slightly. In the damp sand as they approached the ford, the river shallow enough to cross, yet swift enough to be dangerous. Joe's heart raced. She had been alone for so long that the presence of another human, especially Elias, was both comforting and unsettling. She stole a glance at him. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze never left the water or the far bank. Then she saw them. Figures moved in the reeds across the river, shadows blending with the greenery. Joe froze, a cold spike of fear stabbing through her chest. Bandits. The stories she had heard in every saloon and settlement, men who took what they wanted, sparing no one, now loomed real and immediate. "Bandits," Elias muttered under his breath, his hand brushing the rifle strapped across his back. He leaned slightly closer to Jo, as if preparing to shield her without needing her consent. Jo's pulse quickened. "We can't let them take the wagon. Not the supplies, not the land." Her voice was steady, but her stomach churned with fear. The leader of the bandits, a tall man with a crooked hat and a sneer that didn't match his sharp eyes, raised a pistol. "Hand over the wagon, lady." "And no one gets hurt," he called, voice carrying across the water. Elias's hand moved with deliberate calm, resting near his holster. "You picked the wrong people to threaten today," he said, his tone low, dangerous. Jo felt a shiver run down her spine, not from cold, but from the sheer intensity in his voice. The first shot rang out. The crack echoed across the canyon walls, startling birds into the air. Jo ducked instinctively, firing her rifle into the air, hoping to keep herself safe but not yet fully engaged. Elias dove behind a boulder with the grace of a predator, returning fire with precise, measured shots. The horses panicked. One bolted into the river, splashing cold water up over the wagon. Jo gasped, scrambling to regain control, but the momentum of the panicked animal tipped the wagon dangerously to the side. Without hesitation, Elias plunged into the river, water rushing around him. Muscles flexing beneath wet skin, his long hair plastered to his back. He caught the reins of the spooked horse and steadied it. Jo's heart raced, a mix of fear, relief, and something she couldn't name as she watched him work with effortless strength. "Hold on," he shouted over the roar of the river and gunfire, gripping the horse tightly. He pulled it to the bank, then turned to help her stabilize the wagon. Water poured over both of them, drenching their clothes and making the air around them chill with the river's cold. Jo shivered, teeth chattering, but she refused to step back. "I can manage," she began, only to be cut off by the sight of another bandit aiming at her. Elias reacted instantly, stepping between her and the gun. A shot rang out, splintering a branch beside him. Jo's stomach dropped, adrenaline sharp as a knife. Her hand found his arm, gripping it almost reflexively. He looked at her, eyes intense, and for a moment the chaos faded, leaving just the two of them, wet, exhausted, and alive. By the time the dust settled and the bandits retreated into the reeds, the riverbank was littered with trampled grass and the smell of gunpowder. The horses stamped nervously, water dripping from their coats. Jo's clothes clung uncomfortably to her skin, cold and heavy. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering despite the heat of the sun. Elias noticed immediately. "You're freezing," he said, his voice soft now concerned. Without a word, he removed his own wet coat and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth was instant and enveloping, radiating through her like a balm against both the cold and the lingering fear. "Thank you," she murmured, voice low, almost vulnerable. She had never allowed herself to feel safe with another person, let alone reliant on one. "You saved yourself too," Elias said, shaking his head, eyes scanning the river's edge as if expecting another ambush. But his tone had a softness, now that hadn't been there earlier, a quiet admiration for her courage. Jo felt her cheeks heat under his gaze, flustered by the mixture of gratitude, exhaustion, and the unspoken tension simmering between them. The day passed slowly. They set up a temporary camp on the riverbank, using driftwood and rocks to build a small fire. The river's gentle roar provided a strange comfort, masking distant sounds and offering a rhythm to their otherwise tense evening. Jo tried to dry off and warm herself, but the wet fabric clung to her arms and back. She couldn't shake the memory of Elias diving into the river, the strength of his body, the determination in his eyes. Her pulse quickened even as she chastised herself. "Focus, Jo. Survival first. Everything else can wait." Elias, noticing her struggle, offered her a simple smile. "You did well today," he said. "More than well, actually." You kept your cool under fire." Joe bit her lip, a mix of pride and embarrassment rising in her chest. I had help," she admitted. He shrugged, eyes twinkling with something unreadable. "And sometimes help is exactly what's needed." The words were simple, but the meaning lingered in the air between them, unspoken and electric. That night, as they lay near the riverbank, the stars stretching endlessly above, Joe finally allowed herself to relax. Elias sat nearby, keeping watch, the firelight reflecting off his wet hair and strong features. She could hear his breathing, steady and calm, and it made her feel grounded in a way she hadn't felt for years. "I've never been through anything like this," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Elias glanced at her, his expression softening. "None of us choose the hardships we face, but how we face them, that defines us." Joe looked at him, noticing the wet strands of hair clinging to his face, the beads glinting in the firelight. There was a strength in him that went beyond muscle calm, confidence, and an undeniable magnetism that made her pulse race. She pushed the thought away, blaming exhaustion and adrenaline. Hours later, sleep finally claimed them. The river whispered beside them, and the desert, though unforgiving, seemed just a little less threatening with Elias there. Joe dreamed of water, sand, and the strange, intoxicating warmth of human connection, the kind that could survive even the harshest wilderness. When dawn broke, it painted the river in streaks of gold and silver. Joe awoke to Elias already awake, scanning the horizon. No words were needed. Their bond, forged in fear and survival, was palpable. Together, they would face the next leg of their journey, uncertain, dangerous, and alive with possibilities neither had expected. Joe dressed quickly, pulling the wet coat tighter around her, grateful for the warmth that had become almost comforting. Elias helped steady the wagon, his presence silent but solid. Each glance, each small movement between them carried unspoken acknowledgment. They were no longer simply two travelers sharing the same path, they were allies, and something more was beginning to bloom in the harsh wilderness around them. As they crossed the river, the water rushing past, Joe felt a surge of determination. The bandits were gone for now, but the West was full of dangers, treacherous rivers, hidden cliffs, and men who would do anything for gold, land, or revenge. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel entirely alone. Elias caught her gaze, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Ready for the next part of this adventure?" Joe squared her shoulders, gripping the reins, and returned his smile, a flicker of defiance in her green eyes. "Ready." The river behind them and the uncertain trail ahead, they pressed onward, knowing that the true test of courage and perhaps trust was only just beginning. The canyon walls rose like jagged teeth, casting long, twisting shadows across the dusty trail as Josephine guided the wagon along the narrow path. Every ridge and crevice seemed alive, whispering threats and secrets alike. The air was cooler here, but the darkness that settled between the cliffs carried a foreboding weight. Joe's hands ached from gripping the reins, but she refused to let the horses sense her unease. Elias rode beside her, calm and alert, his black hair glinting faintly in the slanted sunlight. The beads and feathers in his hair shifted with every movement, catching the light like small stars trapped in motion. He was silent, scanning the terrain with the precision of a predator, muscles tensed for any sign of danger. Joe felt both reassured and unsettled by his presence. He was protective, yes, but there was something inscrutable in his gaze that made her pulse quicken every time he looked at her. The canyon narrowed further, and Elias motioned for her to stop. "There's something ahead." "Stay alert," he whispered. Joe followed his lead, peering through the twisting shadows, the wagon wheels grinding over rocks and loose sand. She could feel the air shift cooler, damp and faintly metallic. Then she saw it, a thin ribbon of water cascading down a rock face, almost hidden. Behind it, the canyon's mouth opened into a small cavern. The spray misted the air, and the sunlight created dancing prisms on the wet stone walls. Elias dismounted and approached cautiously, his eyes scanning for threats, while Joe parked the wagon nearby. "Looks like a hideout," Elias muttered, voice low. "Could be abandoned. Could still be dangerous. Keep your eyes open." Joe tightened her grip on her rifle, the weight of it comforting. Her curiosity, however, was stronger than fear. Something about the cavern called to her, a promise of secrets and discovery. She followed Elias as he led the way through the veil of water, stepping carefully on slippery stones. The sound of dripping water echoed off the walls, mingling with their cautious footsteps. Inside, the cavern opened into a labyrinth of smaller chambers. Shadows pooled in the corners, and the faint metallic scent of rust and decay hung in the air. Joe's eyes widened as she noticed remnants of an old outlaw hideout, discarded weapons, a tattered map pinned to the wall, and a small chest tucked beneath a pile of broken crates. Elias knelt beside the chest, inspecting it without touching. "This place hasn't seen visitors in decades," he murmured. "But it tells a story. Betrayal, greed, and violence. We need to be careful. Whoever left this might not have left quietly." Joe stepped closer, brushing aside debris to reveal the chest more clearly. She could feel her pulse quicken not just from excitement, but from the knowledge that this discovery could change everything. "Gold?" she whispered, almost to herself. The chest creaked as she opened it, revealing a small stash of coins, jewelry, and trinkets, tarnished but clearly valuable. Elias's eyes narrowed, calculating. This could be worth a small fortune, but it also paints a target on our backs. We can't take it lightly. Joe nodded, excitement and caution battling inside her. She had dreamed of wealth, of securing her father's land, but the reality of danger made her stomach twist. "We'll take only what we need," she said firmly, "and leave the rest." Elias's gaze softened as he studied her. "You're clever, Joe. You think ahead, even in situations like this. That's rare." Joe felt her cheeks heat at the compliment. She tried to mask the warmth with a casual shrug, but Elias noticed anyway. There was an unspoken understanding forming between them, a bond forged by survival, trust, and now shared secrets. As they examined the cavern, Joe discovered more than just treasure. Hidden alcoves revealed faded journals, skeletal remains, and old maps marking trails through the surrounding canyons. Each find painted a picture of the past, of men who had once lived and died for greed, ambition, and vengeance. Joe felt a thrill of discovery, but also a chill at the reminders of mortality. Elias's presence at her side was constant and steady. He lifted fallen debris, held the torch for better light, and kept his eyes on the shadows as if expecting danger at any moment. Joe realized, with a mixture of relief and something she wasn't ready to name, that she felt safer with him than she had in days or years. Night fell faster than either of them expected, and they set up camp at the mouth of the cavern. The fire's warmth battled the chill that seeped from the stone walls. Joe shivered slightly, wet clothes from earlier adventures still clinging uncomfortably to her skin. Elias noticed and wordlessly removed his jacket, draping it over her shoulders. The warmth that enveloped her went beyond the physical, filling a space in her chest that had been empty for far too long. They shared a sparse meal, hardtack jerky, and river water, but conversation was quiet, punctuated by long pauses that were not awkward but electric. Joe couldn't help noticing the strength in Elias's hands, the calm determination in his movements, and the subtle way he glanced at her when he thought she wasn't looking. Hours passed, and the canyon grew darker, the firelight flickering over stone walls. Joe lay against a boulder, blanket wrapped tightly around her, while Elias sat nearby, vigilant. The sound of dripping water was constant, almost hypnotic, as if the cavern itself held its breath. "I've never seen anything like this," Joe admitted softly, almost afraid to break the silence. Elias's eyes met hers, reflecting the firelight. "Few have, and fewer survive it intact." His voice carried an intensity that made her heart race. "You're stronger than you realize, Joe." She looked down, uncertain what to say, caught between pride and vulnerability. I didn't do this alone," she whispered. He smiled faintly, leaning back on his hands. "No, you didn't, but it's rare to find someone who can face the unknown without flinching. You did that today." Joe's pulse quickened at the intimacy in his words. She had faced death, river ambushes, and desert storms, but the awareness of his admiration stirred something new, something unsettling yet thrilling. She shifted slightly, brushing wet strands of hair from her face. I suppose it helps to have someone watching my back," she admitted, almost against her will. Elias's gaze softened, the predatory edge replaced by something almost tender. "I'll always watch your back, Joe. That's a promise." The night deepened, and sleep became inevitable. Joe lay under the faint starlight filtering through the cavern's entrance, the warmth of Elias's jacket around her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to feel safe, even cared for. The desert, the river, and the dangers of the West still loomed, but in this moment she was not alone. Morning brought a new challenge. The maps they had discovered suggested routes through the canyon that could lead to Joe's father's land more quickly, but also more dangerously. Narrow paths, sudden drops, and the possibility of encountering hostile travelers or bandits made each step a test of courage and judgment. Elias helped her load the wagon, guiding the horses over precarious stretches, muscles coiled and alert. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet stone and desert scrub. Joe noticed how his movements were always precise, always careful, and yet effortless. The more she watched him, the more she realized how much she depended on his strength, not just physical, but the steadiness he brought to the uncertainty around them. "You ready?" Elias asked, voice low, a hint of humor in the timbre that made her heart flutter. Joe squared her shoulders, gripping the reins tightly. "As ready as I'll ever be." Together they ventured deeper into the canyon, the shadows stretching longer, and the trail narrowing until only the wagon and horses fit between the towering walls. Every rock, every echo of falling water, every distant cry of a bird reminded them that the canyon was alive and that it had secrets yet to reveal. As they rounded a bend, Joe caught sight of a narrow alcove tucked between the cliffs. Something about it made her uneasy. Instinct told her that danger lurked nearby. Elias noticed her pause and gave a subtle nod, reading her thoughts. "Stay close," he whispered. "No surprises, no mistakes." The journey through the canyon would test them in ways neither could foresee, challenges of trust, courage, and the hidden dangers of a land that seemed to swallow the unwary. And as they moved forward, side by side, Josephine realized that the bond between them was more than survival. It was becoming something deeper, something that might endure even when the canyon's shadows faded behind them. The open prairie stretched endlessly before Josephine as she guided the wagon down the final ridge, the tall grasses swaying in the breeze. After the harrowing desert, the river ambush, and the secrets of the canyon, she had almost forgotten what freedom felt like until now. The land ahead was her father's, the place she had been promised, the place she had fought for. Elias rode beside her, ever watchful, his black hair catching the sunlight, beads and feathers glinting faintly. He had become more than a protector. He was her partner, her anchor through every danger and uncertainty. Yet, even with the familiar reassurance of his presence, Josephine's heart raced with unease. Danger had a way of following them, and she knew the West did not forgive mistakes. Their arrival, however, revealed a new kind of threat. A group of men, their faces hard and weathered, awaited them at the entrance to her father's land. They were armed, their horses stamping impatiently in the dust, and they radiated entitlement, the kind that made Josephine's stomach knot with both anger and fear. "You can't claim this land," one of the men barked, a sneer twisting his lips. "It belongs to our families. Your father's death changes nothing. Step aside, woman." Josephine's hands tightened on the reins. "This land belonged to my father, and now it belongs to me. I will defend it," she said, voice steady, though adrenaline surged through her veins. Elias dismounted silently, his movements smooth, controlled. He stood beside her, muscles coiled, eyes dark with warning. "You will leave," one of the men continued, gesturing with a pistol. Elias didn't respond immediately. He simply shifted, subtly positioning himself to cover Josephine. Time seemed to freeze. The men made a move, and chaos erupted. Guns roared, dust flew, and the scent of gunpowder stung their nostrils. Josephine ducked behind the wagon, heart pounding, and fired her rifle with precision. Elias moved like a shadow, blocking and deflecting with an agility that left the intruders off balance. A horse bolted across the field, scattering the remaining men. One by one, the intruders fled, cursing, tripping, and trampled by their own chaos. Josephine's arms ached, her lungs burned, but she felt a fierce satisfaction. They had underestimated her and Elias. When the last man disappeared over the ridge, Elias approached, brushing dust from his coat. "Are you hurt?" he asked, eyes scanning her carefully. "I'll live," Josephine said, though a shiver ran through her from both exertion and lingering adrenaline. "Thanks to you." He shook his head, offering her a faint smile. "We did this together. You fought just as hard as I did." For the first time in days, Josephine allowed herself a deep breath. The land stretched out before her golden fields, the remnants of her father's homestead and the rolling hills that had seemed so distant and unattainable only days ago. She felt the weight of exhaustion, fear, and triumph settle on her shoulders. Night fell, and Josephine and Elias set up camp near the old homestead. The fire crackled, casting warm light over the worn wooden structures, and the smell of pine smoke mixed with the scent of fresh earth. Josephine tended to minor wounds on the horses while Elias stacked wood, both moving with practiced efficiency. Finally, she allowed herself a moment of reflection, gazing at the stars above. "I never imagined I'd make it here," she admitted quietly, almost to herself. Elias approached and crouched beside her. "You did. You're stronger than you think, Joe." His voice carried a warmth that made her heart flutter. She looked up at him, noticing the way the firelight glinted in his dark eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on his muscular shoulders, the gentle strength radiating from every movement. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered. "Maybe not," he said, brushing a damp strand of hair from her face, "but you survived because you refused to give up, because you refused to let fear rule you." The fire crackled, and silence settled between them, heavy with shared experience and unspoken understanding. Josephine's pulse quickened, a mixture of fatigue and anticipation stirring deep within her. She realized she trusted him completely, not just with her life, but with her heart. Days passed as they restored the homestead, tending the land and preparing for the future. Elias proved invaluable, helping with repairs, clearing debris, and teaching Josephine techniques for handling the rugged terrain. Yet their partnership extended beyond work. Moments of quiet intimacy emerged, shared meals, conversations under the stars, and small gestures of care. Josephine began to recognize that her feelings for Elias were growing deep and undeniable. One evening, after a long day of hauling timber, Josephine and Elias sat near the fire, the sky painted in streaks of amber and crimson. The air was warm, fragrant with wildflowers and earth. Josephine tucked her knees to her chest, watching Elias stretch out beside her. "Why did you come out west?" she asked suddenly, curiosity mingling with lingering vulnerability. He glanced at her, expression thoughtful. "Looking for a life that mattered. Somewhere I could make a difference. And I guess somewhere I could find someone worth trusting." His gaze lingered on hers. "And I found you." Josephine's breath caught. She turned her face away for a moment, heart hammering. She had always been independent, but she realized now that independence didn't mean isolation. She wanted this connection dangerous, unpredictable, and thrilling as it was. Elias shifted closer, and she felt the warmth radiate from him. "I'm not leaving," he said simply. "Not now, not ever." Her resolve softened, a flush rising to her cheeks. I don't want you to," she admitted. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced across their faces, and Elias reached for her hand, strong and reassuring. Their fingers intertwined, a silent promise in the quiet night. Weeks passed, and the homestead flourished. Josephine planted crops, repaired fences, and tended the animals, while Elias hunted and fortified their land against potential threats. Their relationship deepened, rooted in mutual respect, trust, and an undeniable passion that had grown through shared danger and triumph. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge, dust trailing behind him. Josephine tensed, but Elias moved smoothly, hand on his rifle. The rider dismounted, bowing slightly. "I bring word from the neighboring settlements. They've heard of your defense of this land. No one will challenge you again." Josephine exhaled slowly, relief washing over her. She turned to Elias, eyes shining. "We did it. The land is ours." He nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yes. Thanks to both of us." As the sun set, painting the prairie in gold and crimson, Josephine and Elias sat on the porch of the homestead, watching the horizon. The dangers of the desert, the river, and the canyon had passed, leaving them with a hard-won peace. Josephine leaned into Elias, feeling his warmth and strength. "I never expected this," she said softly, tracing the outline of his hand. "Neither did I," he admitted, voice low, "but sometimes the wild teaches us exactly what we need." They shared a quiet laugh, the sound mingling with the whispering prairie wind. The land stretched before them, promising a future they had fought for together. And in the fading light, Josephine realized that survival had brought her more than freedom and security. It had brought her love, partnership, and the courage to face whatever the West might throw at them next. Night deepened, stars glittering above, and Josephine felt an unshakable sense of belonging. With Elias at her side, the vast, unforgiving West had become home, a place where danger and adventure coexisted with trust, love, and hope. The story of Josephine and Elias had begun with peril, with uncertainty, and with the raw edge of survival, but it had ended with triumph, connection, and the promise of life fully lived. And as they sat together, hands entwined, hearts aligned, they knew one undeniable truth. Together, they could face anything the West had yet to throw at them. The homestead, the land, the canyon secrets, and the river ambush were behind them. The future stretched endlessly, bright and full of possibility. And for the first time, Josephine allowed herself to truly relax, knowing that she was no longer alone.